Good evening, everyone, and welcome. My name is Gabrielle Peterson, and I am the Director of Development for the School of Management and Labor Relations. I want to thank you all for being with us today, and I hope that you are all healthy and safe. This webinar is part of the Rutgers University Alumni Association's virtual event series, which offers Rutgers alumni and friends the opportunity to stay connected and hear from faculty, staff, and administration across the university. Just a bit of housekeeping before we begin. If you have any questions, please send them via the Q&A option at any point during the presentation, and we'll discuss at the end of the event. This event is being recorded and will be posted online for continued enjoyment and for those who were unable to make it this evening. Today, we are honored to have with us Dr. Douglas Kruse, Distinguished Professor in the School of Management and Labor Relations, and Dr. Lisa Schur, Professor and past Chair of the Labor Studies and Employment Relations Department at the School of Management and Labor Relations. Dr. Kruse served as a senior economist at the White House Council of Economic Advisors in 2013 and 2014. He received an MA in economics from the University of Nebraska-Lincoln and a PhD in economics from Harvard University. His research has focused on the employment and earnings effects of disability and the causes, consequences, and implications of employee ownership and profit sharing. Dr. Kruse has also published widely in peer-reviewed journals and is an editor of the British Journal of Industrial Relations. He has testified 4 times before Congress on his economic research, been the lead or part of over $10 million in grants, and served on the President's Committee on Employment of People with Disabilities, New Jersey's State Rehabilitation Council, and New Jersey Governor Phil Murphy's transition team. Dr. Schur received a PhD in political science from the University of California-Berkeley and a JD from Northeastern University. Her research focuses on the economic, political, and social inclusion of people with disabilities, particularly their political participation and employment experiences and outcomes. In addition to publishing in peer-reviewed journals, she wrote an invited white paper on disability and voting for the Presidential Commission on Election Administration and co-authored the book, People with Disabilities, Sidelined or Mainstreamed, published by Cambridge University Press. Her work has appeared in many journals, including Industrial Relations, Political Research Quarterly, Behavioral Sciences and the Law, Women in Politics, British Journal of Industrial Relations, and the Stanford Law and Policy Review. She has coordinated 3 national surveys on disability and voter turnout following presidential elections. So without further ado, it is now my privilege to turn it over to Dr. Kruse and Dr. Schur.
There we go. Thank you very much, Gabrielle. Very, very pleased to be here this evening. I'm Doug Kruse, as Gabrielle said. She's already done enough of an introduction, so I don't think I need to provide much more of a way of introduction for myself. Lisa, do you want to say hi?
Hello, everyone. It's great to be here tonight.
So let me try sharing my screen, seeing if I can get this to work. I've got a PowerPoint here, and I hope that works. We're going to do a presentation on our program for disability research. We'd like to make this really just, we've timed it out at about a 20 to 25 minute presentation. We don't want to make it a long one because we want to leave plenty of time for discussion and any thoughts and ideas you may have. We have some questions we're going to be presenting that we would be interested in hearing your thoughts on. I will say, actually, one thing that was not part of my introduction, and I think I'll go ahead and mention it, is that we study disability, but I also have a disability myself, and I did not. When I came to Rutgers, this was back in the dark ages. This was 30 years ago. I came to Rutgers. I was able-bodied, walking around like most everyone. At the end of my second year at Rutgers, Lisa and I were in a car that was hit by a drunk driver who was going about 100 miles an hour, and it very nearly killed me. But I survived. However, it gave me a spinal cord injury, so that I'm a paraplegic. I'm paralyzed from the chest down. And that obviously affected our lives quite a bit. I became very interested as an economist, I became very interested in the economic effects. If you put an economist in a wheelchair, you're going to get a study of the economic effects of being in a wheelchair. In rehab, I became very interested in what can be done to increase employment of people with disabilities. What kind of barriers do they face? What kind of facilitators are there? And in fact, I started a study right after that with a friend of mine, a colleague from Princeton University, on the effects of computer skills for people with disabilities. So that's motivated a lot of my research, really trying to understand what kinds of challenges do people with disabilities face. When I returned to Rutgers, Rutgers was absolutely wonderful in welcoming me back, being very accommodating in a lot of different ways. And I've been able to be a professor in my wheelchair for the past 30 years. I found that I can torture students sitting down just as well as I could when I was standing up. So that's just, perhaps that's TMI, I don't know, but just a quick introduction to some of the personal aspect of this that motivates our interest in this. So let's see. There we go. An overview of the presentation. We'll give a quick introduction to the program first, then talk a little about the context, the economic, social, and political inclusion of people with disabilities. A few examples of our recent employment research. We did a field experiment on hiring. We've done some research on job losses during COVID, and the digital divide in telework. Telework is a topic that's obviously become much more salient to almost all of us in the past couple of years. Then some new employment research. We have 3 multi-year grants on employer policies, public policy, and assistive technology. Then voting research, looking in particular at turnout and accessibility issues. As Gabrielle said, we've had, Lisa has actually coordinated several major surveys funded by the U.S. Election Assistance Commission. And she will talk a little about that. And then we'll like to finish up with questions and opportunities for involvement. Be very, and as part of this, we decided to put some of the questions right up front so that you can think about them as we talk about our different projects. Some of the questions that we'll return to at the end. What can employers, unions, policymakers, and other stakeholders do to increase employment opportunities among people with disabilities? Very important question. The second one, relevant to the pandemic that's affected all of our lives, are employers rethinking the structure of work and workplaces due to the pandemic? And how might this help or hurt people with disabilities? A third question that we're very interested in is, what are the best ways to collaborate with employers, unions, policymakers, and other stakeholders in designing, carrying out, and disseminating disability research? So those are a few things to think about as we go through our material here. And again, we want to keep this fairly short, as I say, 20 to 25 minutes, because we're really interested in hearing your thoughts and ideas on all of this. So a quick introduction to the Program for Disability Research. It was established back in 2000. The program has received over $24 million in grants with a focus on employment of people with disabilities and political participation among people with disabilities. We were very honored this last year. In fact, this happened last January. We just found out about a peer-reviewed journal article by researchers in Spain, where they looked at all of the articles, all the research that's been published in top journals on disability and employment in the past 30 years. And they analyzed the data in a variety of ways. One of the things they did was to rank it by institution, and Rutgers came out number one in the world. So we were very happy about that. I was very happy to tell my mother, of course. You always want to make your mother proud of you. We are very committed to making research results useful and having a real world impact, as I think you'll be able to tell as we go through this. Our research has also gotten a lot of good media, a lot of good attention. In fact, it's been cited in over 400 unique media articles in the past 5 years, including several in the New York Times, We had a PBS NewsHour segment that was done on our research, several articles in Time, USA Today, and international news outlets. So we've gotten ourselves some good attention for what that's worth. Our program, the disability employment research we've done, includes studies of several topics: corporate culture, telework, we'll be talking more about, employer attitudes toward job applicants, occupational projections, done by the Bureau of Labor Statistics. We've matched up to data there. Job requirements and pay disparities, contingent work, another very important and timely topic, union membership, and intersectionality of disability with gender, race, and ethnicity. The political participation research that Lisa will talk some more about includes studies of disability in relation to levels and trends in voter turnout, voting methods, polling places and mail ballots, difficulties in voting, access to information on the voting process. We've got a project going on right now that Lisa will mention, and other forms of political participation and civic engagement. So the context here, some of you may be familiar with people with disabilities and may be familiar with some of these statistics, but I'll give just a quick overview. There are over 1 billion people with disabilities worldwide and 61 million in the United States. It's estimated that about, depending on the measure you use, about 1/6, 1 out of every 6 people in the United States have some sort of disability. And that's obviously a wide range of disabilities. Could be physical, mental, cognitive, sensory, hearing, seeing, and so forth. So that's a broad definition. The 1990 Americans with Disabilities Act, the ADA, I'm sure some of you are familiar with, has led to great improvements in the accessibility of public accommodations, such as stores, restaurants, and public transportation. There's no denying that. It's made a big difference. The 2006 UN Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities has also spurred many forms of progress worldwide. But, and a big but here, there actually hasn't been that much economic progress. Despite advances in some areas, people with disabilities have made little economic progress. It's still true that only 1/3 of US working age people with disabilities are employed, less than half the rate of people without disabilities. Employed people with this, and among those who are employed, they are overrepresented in low wage and contingent jobs with little opportunity for advancement. And partly as a result of the low employment, 1/4 of people with disabilities live in poverty, which is twice the rate of people without disabilities. There's a connection as well with the political involvement. The lack of economic inclusion contributes to the lack of political and social inclusion, as Lisa will talk about. The voter turnout among citizens with disabilities is 6 to 8 points lower than among citizens without disabilities. And that's a large part of why the US Election Assistance Commission has been eager to work with us in doing research on this. Also, there's lower civic engagement in general and greater social isolation among people with disabilities. So that's the overall context. Turning to some of the research we've done, let me just mention a couple of the recent employment studies, and I'll turn it over to Lisa then, that we've done on people with disabilities. One study we did that got quite a bit of attention is called the Disability Employment Puzzle, a field experiment on employer hiring behavior. In our field experiment, we submitted job applications for just over 6,000 accountant positions in response to job ads by US employers. These were actual job ads, actual employers. We were able to, we sent off job applications to them, and we varied, we sent out the same, resume, and in the cover letter, we just mentioned a disability in some of them randomly. It turns out that employers were 26% less likely to express interest in an applicant with a disability, either a spinal cord injury or Asperger's were the two we use, mentioned in the cover letter, even though these disabilities should not affect productivity in accounting. We wanted to make sure we were not tapping into productivity concerns. The results point to extra difficulties in attracting employer interest among applicants with disabilities. even when the applicants are highly skilled. Actually, we in our resumes, we gave them Rutgers degrees. So obviously they were highly skilled. The resumes had Rutgers degrees. And the disabilities are unlikely to affect employee productivity. This is consistent with other evidence that they were often last hired, first fired. And there have been a couple of studies since then replicating our findings. Our study did get some nice attention. It was featured in the New York Times article.
Doug?
Yes?
One second. We have a question that came in, and I don't know if you want to answer it now, if you want to hang on to the end.
Oh, I'm glad to answer it now.
Sure. So somebody asked, could you attribute some of the unemployment to individuals needing to qualify for benefit programs with income and or asset limitations?
Say they attribute some of the employment
Could
gap
you attribute
to,
some of the unemployment to individuals needing to qualify for benefit programs with income and or asset limitations?
that's a great question. That's something that's been the number of disability researchers have been looking at. There are two major forms of disability income. Don't want to go into too much detail, but two major forms of disability income. One is Social Security disability income, disability insurance, SSDI. Just like people get Social Security when they retire, you can also get Social Security if you get a disability that prevents you from working. In addition, there's SSI, supplemental security income, that's available to low income people with disabilities or elderly people. Both of those programs have asset limits, income limits, and the SSI has an asset limit as well. So that if you work too much, you can work a little under each program, but if you work too much, then you no longer become qualified. And we're actually looking at that. We're part of a new one of the big new grants that Lisa will be talking about is a public policy grant, where we've got some researchers looking at the effects of that. It's not it's an important factor. It's not the dominant factor. Only about 1/3 of working age people with disabilities have one of these forms of disability income with these kinds of limits. So it's important for a segment of the population, but not the kind of dominant explanation for the employment limits. It's a great question. Looking at this next project, we've worked with our colleague at Rutgers, Yana Rogers, on COVID-19 and employment losses among workers with disabilities. Obviously, there's been a lot of social and economic losses due to COVID-19 around the globe. Those losses have been disproportionately borne by women, minorities, and low-income groups. Before the pandemic, there was a large disability employment gap, as I described. And we find that in earlier recessions, people with disabilities were hit hardest with job losses. They are more likely to be laid off when times are bad than people without disabilities. In the good labor market of the late 90s, it turns out that the disability employment gap started to close. The gap was widening up through 2015, but it started to close in that hot labor market the last 5 years, last 6 years. But then the pandemic hit, and the pandemic appears to have erased this progress. In particular, we saw that as the pandemic hit, people with disabilities had a big drop in employment. The people with disabilities are the blue line here. The orange line is people without disabilities. And you can see in April of 2020, there was a bigger drop among people with disabilities. And that gap was maintained over that entire year. We looked at the entire year of their experience. Why is that? Well, that's mainly because people with disabilities are more likely to be in service and blue collar jobs that cannot be done at home, that cannot be teleworked. And Lisa's going to talk a little more about that. More detailed analysis shows that white and Black women with disabilities bore a heavier burden of employment losses during the pandemic. About 1/4 of the greater employment drop for workers with disabilities was due to occupation, as I was just saying. They're more likely to be in blue collar and service jobs that were especially hard hit by the pandemic. Another quarter is due to differences in education, industry, and other personal characteristics. Regarding education, people with disabilities do have, on average, lower levels of education. They're less likely to be college graduates, for example. And that's part of what explains not just the employment gap, but also the voting gap that Lisa will talk about. But even after controlling for everything else, there's still a large unexplained gap in the employment drop, which is consistent with the prior evidence that people with disabilities are last hired, first fired. They tend to be let go first. At this point, I'm going to turn it over to Lisa to talk about her other employment studies and the voting research.
So I've unmuted, but I don't see myself here, but that's okay. Can you hear me, Doug, and everyone?
Yes, I can.
All right. So obviously, computer skills are very important in today's economy and having access to the internet. We find that people with disabilities were 3 times more likely to live in homes without internet access in 2020. And you can see there, if you control for age, it's not just among older people, it's among working age people, young people as well. They're less likely to live in a home with internet access. And people with disabilities are also about twice as likely, excuse me, to not be accessing the internet from any location. This was in 2019. And if you could give me the next slide, Doug.
I'm trying, but somehow, oh, there we go.
There we go. So obviously having internet access clearly affects your opportunities for work in general, and most directly your opportunities for doing telework. Before the pandemic, workers with disabilities were actually more likely to be working primarily from home, although the gap has been closing a bit over time. And again, you can see the blue line are people with disabilities and the orange line are people without disabilities. So next slide. But again, there's a big limit on the potential for expanding telework among workers with disabilities. Only about 1/3 are in jobs where the essential tasks can be done primarily at home. And that's compared to 2/5, about 40% of workers without disabilities. And again, this goes back to what Doug was saying. Why is this? Workers with disabilities are disproportionately in service and blue collar jobs that can't be done at home. These are jobs like food service, working as a home health care aide, or certain kinds of manufacturing. As a result of these occupational differences, workers with disabilities were less likely to be teleworking during the pandemic. And again, you can see the blue line here. What does it mean going forward for telework and workers with disabilities in the post-pandemic era? And I just want to say that before we go on to this, telework can be a really great option for a lot of people with disabilities in terms of work. People who might have mobility issues, for example, or need to be close to home for medical reasons or doctor's appointments or whatever. So this can be a good option for people, but it might not, work as well for some people with disabilities. The COVID pandemic was a blow to all workers, but it might have a silver lining for some workers with disabilities if it makes work from home easier and more acceptable to employers and coworkers. But again, that potential is limited by the current types of jobs that are held by workers with disabilities. But again, the pandemic is shaking up traditional workplace structures and ways of doing business, and it might cause employers to rethink how essential tasks can be done. And that might expand their views of workplace accommodations, what's reasonable. And if the work gets done, does it matter whether it's done on site or at home? So I want to mention some new employment research that we're doing. We have 2 new 5-year rehabilitation research and training centers. They're funded by $4.3 million grants from the US Department of Health and Human Services. And we've partnered with other institutions on these. They include Syracuse University, Harvard, and Indiana universities, as well as important disability organizations, such as the National Organization on Disability and Disability In. So the first center, the Employer Disability Practices Center, has a variety of projects, and they include studying the effects of year-by-year changes in HR policies among 200 large companies, and we're going to be using detailed surveys here. What we're doing, and this is a first, this hasn't been done before, is we're implementing randomized experiments, doing interventions in terms of content of job ads, the way companies communicate disability policies, and disability training in several companies. And we can look at recruitment, hiring, satisfaction, job opportunities before and after these interventions are done to see what is actually most effective. And we are still recruiting companies, so we're interested in talking to you if you're interested in that. The second center is the Disability Inclusive Employment Policy Center. And this one, instead of looking at employer policies, is looking at the effects of public policies on the employment of people with disabilities. And again, our focus is always to facilitate better employment outcomes. The Rutgers projects here include looking at state level laws that require paid sick leave and paid family leave for employees, such as New Jersey, looking at telework and other home-based work, looking at contingent work. People with disabilities are more likely to be in contingent and non-traditional jobs, and whether they enjoy employment protections. Looking at unemployment insurance, and looking at minimum and sub-minimum wages. So another more employment research, we have a 4-year project with CUNY, which is funded by the National Science Foundation. And here we're looking at the potential of assistive technology to increase employment, productivity, and wages of people with disabilities. What happened here was that engineers at CUNY developed a wearable robot. It's basically this high-tech jacket that helps increase strength and flexibility and dexterity of people with upper body impairments. At Rutgers, we're looking at the economic and policy implications, both public policies and workplace policies. We're going to be using large-scale government data sets to analyze the effects of specific impairments and the potential for this type of assistive technology to improve employment and earnings of people with disabilities. And we're also going to be talking to companies and employees about HR implications and how to integrate this type of assistive technology into the workplace. And of course, I was going to say $1 million question, but probably more than that. Who should pay for this, right? That's an important question.
Actually, Lisa, if I could just mention,
Yeah.
I can't resist mentioning this wearable robot these engineers have developed. Reminds me a lot of RoboCop. For those of you who have seen that movie, the guy who's able to, he's basically half robot. I'm really interested to try this on myself. I haven't not been able to try on the prototype of this thing, but I think it'll be great fun. I will be a robo professor, something like that.
Yeah.
Couldn't resist mentioning.
I think you just dated us, Doug. But I think, yeah. Anyway, so I want to just talk finally about some of our voting research. Just as there's this employment gap between people with and without disabilities, there's also this voting gap, this stubborn gap of about 6 to 8 points in national elections. And again, you can see the disability, that's the blue bar there, and voter turnout is lower, has been lower. We find that this voting gap is only partly explained by gaps in education and economic resources, social isolation, and a sense of political efficacy, that you're able to participate in politics and that politicians listen to people like you and pay attention to you. Those are also important. If you don't feel that you have efficacy, you're not going to be too motivated to vote. What's really fascinating here is that employment plays a critical role for people with disabilities. There is absolutely no voting gap between employed people with and without disabilities. And this points to the importance not only of having economic resources, but also the social connections, the feelings of efficacy and connection that are gained through work. But as Doug mentioned, and we mentioned before, only about a third of people with disabilities are employed. So there's a big gap among the non-employed people. Inaccessible voting systems also discourage turnout. If you can't vote easily, or you get someplace, your polling place has steps and you're in a wheelchair, for example, that sends the message that people with disabilities are not expected to participate. They're not really part of the democratic process. From 2012 and 2020, we conducted these national post-election surveys on behalf of the US Election Assistance Commission. And we found the good news is that voting difficulties declined significantly among voters with disabilities from 2012 to 2020. The bad news here, though, is that people with disabilities are still almost twice as likely as people without disabilities to have difficulty voting. And that's both, I should say, in person in polling places, as well as by mail. So we have a new project. We've received an additional $260,000 grant from the US Election Assistance Commission. We're going to be doing a nationally representative survey of citizens with and without disabilities in 2022. We're going to be looking at where eligible voters get their information on the voting process. We're not talking about who to vote for, but we're talking about where to vote and how to actually cast your vote. And how does the digital divide affect access to voting information? If a voting commission is just putting out information digitally on the internet and there's this big digital divide, well, that's not going to be that effective. And furthermore, are the election websites themselves fully accessible to people with a variety of disabilities? What more can be done to assure that voters have all the information they need to vote easily and securely? Well, we would welcome the opportunity to work with Rutgers alumni on several of these projects. Just to give you a few examples, surveying employees on experiences of telework during the pandemic and whether they want to continue doing telework going forward. Looking at employer practices, HR practices to improve opportunities for workers with disabilities. Interviewing managers and workers on the role of assistive technology. And anything else that you can think of, we would be delighted to talk with you about. To conclude, people with disabilities continue to face gaps in economic and political inclusion, particularly in the areas of employment and voting. And again, I want to come back to the questions that Doug raised at the beginning. We're very interested in what you think employers, unions, government, other stakeholders can do to increase employment opportunities for people with disabilities. Will employers be rethinking the structure of workplaces after the pandemic, assuming we get there? And how might this help and or hurt people with disabilities? And what are the best ways to collaborate with employers, unions, policymakers, and other stakeholders in designing, carrying out, and disseminating disability research?
So that's our presentation.
Yes.
We'll give you a thank you at this point.
Yes.
Perhaps it'd be useful if I went back to this, lift this up for a few minutes, so people can look at these questions and think about them and ask us, answer those questions for us, or perhaps come up with other questions. We are open to anything.
So we have a couple of things that came in, but I don't think related to these questions, but one is more of a comment that a related concern for employers perhaps could be the cost of government required accommodations for disabilities. The person said that they've run into this in their line of work regarding closed captioning and how that's become standard. It's just a kind of a comment.
Yeah, that if I could
You want to
just,
take that one, Deb? Go ahead.
well, yeah, no, that's a really good point, and that's been one of the greatly discussed issues about employment of people with disabilities is to what extent are accommodations costly. We did some research actually with the Department of Labor, U.S. Department of Labor grant on accommodations in the workplace, and most accommodations don't have a financial cost to them, or the employers report the financial cost is zero. But there are a few, like building a ramp and special technologies that can cost quite a bit. That's a small minority, but but those do exist. We found, interestingly, that one of the common responses of employers is, well, other coworkers will get jealous. So we actually we surveyed over 6,000 employees in different companies about their experience of accommodations. The accommodations not only for people with disabilities, but people without disabilities as well. I think an important point is people without disabilities often get accommodations to meet their personal needs. You get, you get chairs, you get lights, you get stuff like that to help you function in your job. And we looked at the effects of that and found that overwhelmingly, coworkers report that they respond positively to a coworker getting an accommodation. It's seen as being a good, well, oftentimes, of course, people are friends with the person getting the accommodation, but also it's seen as being a good move by the company. That it illustrates a company commitment to helping meet employee needs. If a company is doing something to make it easier for a worker to work and make the worker more productive. So it's actually a very fascinating issue, and we could talk a lot more about it, but that's just a couple of thoughts there, that it is a concern that a lot of employers express. But we think it's a more and more nuanced thing, that most accommodations really cost little or nothing. So it often gets overblown a bit. Go ahead.
I just wanted to give a plug for JAN. This is the Job Accommodations Network, and employers can get free advice on how to do accommodations to assist people with disabilities going forward. And if people are interested, we'd be glad to put their contact information up at the end of this. I think it's a really excellent organization that works closely with employers.
They've got, yeah, I'm glad you mentioned that. They've got, thousands of experts out there who can deal with most every kind of disability, every kind of technology. And the Job Accommodation Network is sponsored by the U.S. Department of Labor. It's an excellent resource.
Can I add something else here before we go on to the next question? I see that Kisa Great has a comment up. She says, I work for vocational rehabilitation for the blind and visually impaired. And she says that most employers are unaware of the assistive technology that exists, and that once they are informed, they are more open to hiring and providing the accommodations. And I completely agree with you, Kisa. I think a lot of employers have not had experience working with people with disabilities. And once they actually see that it's not, climbing Mount Everest, they actually are much more open to providing accommodations and hiring. I want to turn now to Deborah's question here. And I think, Deborah, that you were in my class. If it's the same Deborah, I just want to say hi. And your question is, do you think that with all workers going remote due to COVID, will all salaries start to level out? Will the employment gap lessen? And I just want to say here that not only do people who telework tend to earn less than people who are on site working, but among the group of people who telework, people with disabilities earn less. So telework itself is not like a panacea. By itself, it doesn't seem to be, getting rid of that salary gap. But I think once we're aware of that, as more and more people do go remote and this becomes a more common thing, then possibly we will see an evening out. Do you have any comments on that, Doug? Do you want to?
Well, yeah, no, I think that's a really interesting question.
Yeah.
Telework has many disadvantages that I think most all of us have become familiar with. There may be some advantages in that you're free of you're free of some of the office politics and the interpersonal dynamics that may hurt people with disabilities. Also, you may be with telework, maybe you'll be judged more on your actual output, on your actual performance. What you do at the end of the day, rather than how much you laugh at the boss's jokes and stuff like that. So people may be judged more by performance, in which case that should be good for people with disabilities. And it could end up evening out that wage disparity, as you were suggesting. I think that I think that's very much a live possibility.
I actually have a question for both of you. I don't know if you wanted to mention, maybe Lisa, your class that you taught for the minor that's going to be coming up.
Oh, I'd love to. So this last semester, I taught an online class on disability, work, and society. And it's going to be the gateway class for a new minor in disability studies, which is a multidisciplinary minor. We have professors teaching from all different departments and schools. We have the dance department, the Blaustein School of Public Policy. We have the School of Management and Labor Relations. We have poli-sci. We have landscape architecture. It's a really wonderful program. And it is going to be, we think it is going to be launched officially in the fall. And if anyone is interested in knowing more about it, we're happy to talk about it. I think it's a wonderful program. The class went very well. Of course, I'd rather be doing this in person, but I think it's also the kind of class that can work well remotely.
We're hopeful that this disability studies minor will really take off. As Lisa said, we've been working with like 15 to 20 professors from all across Rutgers, and there seems to be a lot of interest. So we're very hopeful that this disability studies minor will take off. So someone who's doing a major in economics or dance or kinesiology, they're going to be a PT or an OT. They can take a minor in disability studies and learn a lot about this situation of people with disabilities.
And it's interesting that I find that more and more undergraduates are interested in taking a class on disability, and we have some absolutely wonderful students who are very informed and very engaged and really passionate about this. So that's very encouraging going ahead.
I'm waiting for some more questions to come in. If anybody has a question, now is the best time to do it, or to answer one of the questions that are proposed on the screen.
I would be very interested to hear from anyone about their experience with workers with disabilities in the workplace, or if you have a disability yourself, your own experience in the workplace. I'm not trying to pry, but just very curious about what people's perceptions are about the barriers that people will face, or what can be done to help people with disabilities. If there's anybody who has thoughts on that.
Oh, the other thing I wanted to mention is you can contact us later, but if you have experience in this area and you're interested in possibly giving a presentation or talking to students in the disability minor, please contact us and we can probably arrange for that to happen next semester. Well, that might be it for comments and questions, Gabrielle. Oh, wait, here's one. Are there studies comparing different kinds of disabilities, like mental versus physical, or different kinds of disabilities in each category along the parameters you mentioned? And the answer is yes. I'll just mention an early, very important study by Marjorie Baldwin that found that people with the most stigmatized disabilities, such as mental illness, tend to have faced the most employment discrimination. And that, I believe, still continues. Do you want to add to that, Doug?
Yeah, there have been some really interesting studies of degree of stigma attached to different types of disabilities. As Lisa was mentioning, when Margie Baldwin did this study, there's some disabilities that really attract very little stigma, having I think at the top of their scale were things like ulcers or stuff like that. Well, who doesn't have an ulcer? Well, lots of us don't have ulcers, I hope, but that's not a big deal. But something like epilepsy was a really interesting case where, with the proper medication, people with epilepsy can be perfectly productive, no problem at all. Nonetheless, epilepsy has a lot of stigma associated with it. If people find out that you have epilepsy, oh geez, they're always a little nervous around you. Oh, what's going to happen? What if they have a seizure? What do I need to do? So there's a lot of stigma about that. For people with in wheelchairs like me, there's certainly some stigma, but not as much as for people with mental impairments or cognitive impairments. With someone in a wheelchair like me, I'm fairly predictable. People can see pretty much right away. I can, that they know I think I can talk, communicate just fine, but I just can't walk. However, with someone with the cognitive impairment, there's a lot more difficulties with communication. Similarly, with people who are deaf or blind, there can be a lot more problems in communication. So, but going back to the question about differences among types of disability, yes, there have been studies on those, and they do find that, as Lisa said, people with mental or cognitive impairments tend to have the lowest rates of employment. Interestingly, people with hearing impairments do the best among people with disabilities in general. People with hearing impairments do the best. They still face a lot of face some employment barriers, particularly if they're totally deaf. And in fact, we're advising someone in Blaustein right now that doing a senior project analyzing this. She's deaf herself, and we're meeting with her every week and giving her guidance on studying the employment situation of deaf people, particularly focusing on the interaction with education. To what extent does education help overcome the economic disparities faced by deaf people, or do those disparities remain? That's an issue not just for deaf people, but for people with disabilities in general, of course. So that's a long-winded answer. The short answer to your question is yes. There have been studies on this, and it's a very important and interesting question because there is such a wide degree of variation in types of disability, types and severity of disability.
So I see another question here from Stephanie. Are you able to provide contact information for the various Rutgers research programs that individuals may be able to work on? And I believe we can do that.
Yes,
but it
we
might
will
be
have
easier. Yeah, I'm sorry, go ahead.
No, that's fine. We'll have the screen. The contact information will pop up
Great.
in a few seconds, minutes, maybe.
Yeah, I think it's easier to type this rather than to go through this.
Yeah.
Right. And the best approach is, we don't have separate
right.
contact information for each of the projects. The best thing is just to talk to us about the projects, and we will talk to you about how you might get involved or learn more about these.
right, exactly.
And it'll go out in the thank you email so that you'll receive a follow-up email after this, probably maybe tomorrow, and it'll have all the contact information too. So that'll be accessible for everyone. If you don't capture it on the slide coming up. But we do have one other question. Do you have recommendations on how people can make their workplaces aware of the accommodations that they need?
Doug, do you want to start?
Okay, that's
That's
a great question.
It's a great
I
question.
was hoping Lisa would jump in with the correct answer there. How to make, I mean, just at a real basic level, of course, it's good to start with the HR department to make sure that they have someone who knows the ADA responsibilities of employers, who can and who knows about the accommodation process. There's a lot of great resources. As Lisa was talking about, the Job Accommodations Network, but there's a lot of other great resources as well. It's actually, this makes me think, in terms of making the company aware of disability issues, I think that's the way to go. One of the issues that employees face, a lot of employees with disabilities face, is whether to reveal a disability. There's a big distinction between visible and invisible disabilities. Someone like me in a wheelchair, obviously, people will see that I have a disability. But there's a lot of invisible disabilities, things like epilepsy and so forth, that may not be obvious. And in those cases, it's a really interesting question of when and where and to whom an employee should reveal that he or she has a disability. If you want to get accommodations, you need to reveal that you have a disability and start that whole process. But it's absolutely true that a lot of people with disabilities don't want to reveal their disability. They fear that they're going to be treated badly or subject to stigma. And that's a very tricky issue. In fact, well, I'll just mention here briefly, one of the big projects in our Employer Practices Center is trying to figure out, with the National Organization on Disability, how to increase self-disclosure among employees with disabilities, in particular, because the federal government, for its federal contractors, it establishes a goal that all of its federal contractors should have 7% of their employees identified with a disability. It's not a quota, it's not an absolute requirement, but it's a goal that the federal government would like to see among its federal contractors. Well, most of these federal contractors have about 3% of their employees identified with disability. So we're working with them, National Organization on Disability, which has the largest 200 or 300 of the largest companies in the US, working with them to try to figure out what kinds of messages can the company send to help employees feel comfortable in disclosing a disability, to feel that there's a greater climate of inclusion.
So can I jump in there, Doug? I'm sorry, I interrupted you. Go ahead.
No, please do.
So just to go back to the question, clearly talking to HR is a good place to start. Also, if the company has a diversity office or a diversity officer, we find that the best companies tend to see disability as an aspect of diversity, and that the overall diversity climate includes disability, includes people with disabilities, rather than having that as a separate thing for, just, workers' compensation or whatever if someone gets injured, but to have that all included together. So I would absolutely contact the diversity officer and see about changing messages of the company in terms of diversity to include disability as well, because that is part of diversity. There's sort of two aspects. One are the legal requirements, which every company should be aware of, what is required under the ADA and to be non-discriminatory. But maybe as important, or if not more important, is the culture and the climate of an organization, and whether it really welcomes people with disabilities and treats them with respect and equality. And then that comes down to going forward, the message of inclusion, the message of we really do value diversity, and building a culture of trust so that employees and job applicants feel comfortable revealing that they have a disability and will need accommodations. It's if that occurs, then it's much easier for employees from the get-go to ask for that rather than to be struggling for however long in a job position and then say, oh my goodness, do I reveal that I have a disability and I need accommodations? So those are just some thoughts on that.
Actually, if I could just mention a quick anecdote here, in working with the National Organization on Disability, we learned about a company, and I probably shouldn't say the name of the company, but everyone would recognize the company, very large company, where the one of the major vice presidents, one of the major executives in the company, sent out a message to all employees about how much the pandemic, dealing with the pandemic, had increased his anxiety and how he was struggling with dealing with the pandemic, and some of the psychological issues that presented for him. In the month after that, the number of people with the number of employees in that company who revealed issues with anxiety themselves doubled. You know, that it was establishing a different kind of culture, climate. It was sending a message that, hey, we've all been having problems with this, and it's created a lot of stresses in our lives. It's created a lot of anxiety and created some PTSD for some people. But I think that's a nice illustration of how companies, the messages that companies send can make a real difference.
All right, well, I think we've reached our time. It's almost 7 o'clock. So I want to thank Dr. Kruse and Dr. Schur for this wonderful presentation tonight. And I would, there we go. I think we have some parting slide that'll go up in a second, but you will be receiving an email with some follow-up contact information if you have any questions and want to reach out to them. And we thank you for joining us tonight. We hope you will join us for another virtual event in the future, and stay connected on ouralumni.com. And everyone have a great night.
Thank you all.
Thank you.